Hi, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming. It's really great to have you here because we've got an exciting announcement today. So, my name is Paul Ruijs, and I'm an specialist at Robeco. We are a mid-sized asset manager with around 16 offices globally and 180 billion euros in assets under management. Now, the vast majority of this capital is invested through sustainable investing strategies. And in fact, our heritage as a sustainable investor dates back for roughly 3 decades. Now, and one of the things that characterizes us as a sustainable investor is that we are a very research-driven organization and develop a lot of sustainable investing tools in-house. And these range from forward-looking climate analytics to biodiversity investment frameworks, but also company SDG scores and country ESG scores. Now, traditionally speaking, when we think about ways for investors to have an impact, we've roughly talked about 2 concepts, and those are exit and voice. So with exit, we mean portfolio construction or asset allocation. So which companies do we choose to invest in? And equally important, which companies do we choose not to invest in? Now, the effectiveness of these strategies is heavily debated, especially in the context of listed assets or secondary markets, but that's not the topic of today's conversation. And the second term is voice. So here we're talking about voting and engagement. So as an investor, we also engage in dialogues with our investee companies on key sustainability issues, which in turn can have a positive effect on society. But now there's this third concept that has emerged into the debate of how investors can create impact. And this is called field building. Now, with a field, we refer to the external environment of a company, sort of the context within which it operates. So field building means that investors are exerting an influence on that external environment of these companies indirectly, for instance, by changing the stakeholders, the norms, the values, and expectations that surround these companies, and thereby encourage more positive business conduct. Now, there are various different strategies that can be applied, and I encourage you to read this article, but one of them is called sharing your expertise with others. Now, so that's also what we're here about today. So for instance, you could share your sustainable investing tools with the wider world. And in light of that, I stand here in front of you to announce today that we are opening up some of our sustainable investing intellectual property to the wider world. Now, I hope that was a nice teaser. At least it was quite an introduction to what we're here to talk about today. So one of the things that we're sharing are our corporate SDG scores that we create through our SDG framework. So I'll tell you all about the framework, how it works in practice, and how we score companies on their impact on these goals. Now, the other thing that we're sharing are our country ESG scores. And although less extensively, I also shed some light on that methodology and how these scores can be used in investment processes. And then, of course, I'll tell you everything there's to know about our SI Open Access initiative. And in the end, there will also be room for Q&A. If you do have any burning questions in the meantime, please feel free to raise your hands, then we can get around to it. But also make sure that there's plenty of time in the end. Now, without further ado, let's kick off with the SDG framework. So with the SDG framework, we assess the impacts of companies on the Sustainable Development Goals. And at Robeco, we really believe that the SDGs are a great blueprint for sustainable investing. Because first of all, they're very holistic and broad. So they range from zero poverty to ensuring quality education to protecting our climate and biodiversity. But they're also incredibly detailed, with around 169 targets and even more indicators to track progress. And above all that, all countries in the world have agreed towards achieving these goals. So that was really quite an historic moment. And admittedly, as we all know, as progress is not exactly where we want it to be, there is still a lot of momentum around these goals. And we also, investors, believe that they're incredibly relevant for investments as well. Now, that's for a variety of reasons. We believe that the SDGs are really useful at spotting opportunities in the market because the SDGs present great business opportunities. They also help avoid investing in companies that might have less of a license to operate in the future. Sustainability is increasingly part of regulatory compliance as well, so we use the SDG framework to also define what a sustainable investment is in the context of SFDR. But most importantly, they help you to align with positive impact and create a positive impact as an investor. Now, that's all well and good, so let's delve into it and cut to the chase. I'll first explain some of the core principles of our SDG framework, really some of the founding philosophy, before I go into how this works in practice. And starting off, with the SDG framework, we really want to capture the most significant impacts that companies are having. Because by virtue of their size and complex stakeholder relationship across the supply chains, companies have a wide variety of impacts, and they can be both positive and negative. So through our framework, we're assessing thousands of companies at the same time on their impact on these goals. And in doing so, we really have to boil down to the most significant impacts, and we can't account for all the impacts that companies are having on these goals. Now, secondly, we apply a global and absolute approach, meaning that companies around the world are assessed against the same yardsticks, so we don't differentiate between emerging markets and developed markets, for instance. And we also do not apply a best-in-class approach, for instance, differentiating between leaders and laggards within an industry. Because you can wonder, what if an industry in itself is not sustainable or not there for the long term? Now, and lastly, and this is also quite relevant, we firmly believe that if we're really serious about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, then probably one of the first things that we should do is avoiding doing significant harm towards these goals, right? So in our scoring system, we do not allow companies to compensate significant negative impacts on one goal with positive impacts elsewhere. So we really stand behind this holistic and integral approach. So our SDG framework consists of 3 steps, and those are the products and services of companies, their operations, and controversies. So in the first step of the SDG framework, and this is also, I would say, the most important step of the framework, where really most of the scores are generated, we look at companies' core business activities, and we determine whether we believe these are good or bad for sustainability. And we do this with over 300 indicators across various industries that really measure this. So this is a very top-down and rules-based approach. Now, in the second step of the framework, we look at companies' business practices. For instance, do we see any patterns of questionable business conduct? Or do we see a company exhibit, for instance, really high recycling rates in its manufacturing processes? Now, and then in the last step, we check whether or not companies are involved in any controversies that harm progress towards the goals. And in addition to looking at the severity of the harm that has been incurred, we also look at whether companies have implemented preventative measures to prevent this from occurring again in the future, and whether they also compensated for the damage that was done in the first place. Now, the outcome of these 3 steps are then also consolidated or quantified in an SDG score. And these scores range from -3, so highly negative, to +3, high positive. And so companies are assigned an SDG score on every SDG that's relevant to their business. And these are then also consolidated into one overall score. And we do that through a so-called min-max rule. And that means that as long as a company has all neutral scores or positive scores, then we take the highest score to become the final score of that company. But once a company has one negative score on any of the SDGs, that means that the final or overall score of this company is the lowest score, and there's a negative score. Now, on the right side, we see the distribution of the S2G scores across the MSCI All Country World Index. So we see that approximately 55% of the companies get a positive score, so ranging from +1 to +3. Around 20% of the companies get a neutral score, and around a quarter of the companies get a negative score. And as you can imagine, these scores can be very useful in creating SDG-aligned strategies. So for instance, you might choose to not invest in a company with a negative score, or even only be wanting to invest in companies with positive SDG scores, or even on individual SDGs. But now let's look one level deeper at the individual SDGs that companies are impacting. So one of the things that we see on this slide is that the strongest positive alignment of these companies in the MSCI ACWI is with SDG 9, so industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So here you could think about companies that are providing the materials that go into building the infrastructure, or the construction companies itself. You could also think about technology companies that really contribute to this theme of innovation. Now, we also see quite some positive alignment with SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. Because underneath SDG 8, there is a sub-target specifically calling for an increase in access to capital for small and medium enterprises. So in our SDG framework, in the business line for banks, we have a KPI that measures this. So the more revenues a bank is generating from lending activities to small and medium enterprises, the higher its score can become on SDG 8. Now, we also see quite some positive alignment for SDG 3. So here you could think about healthcare services or pharmaceutical companies. But now let's move to the other side of the spectrum, to the negative impact. Now, the first one should probably come as no surprise, and that's that we see that the most negative alignment is with climate action. But we also see quite some negative alignment with SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So here, for instance, you could think of weapon manufacturers, but also simply companies that do not pass our good governance test. And we also see quite some negative alignment on SDG 3, good health and well-being. So here, of course, you could think about tobacco, alcohol, gambling activities, but also soft drinks or unhealthy food. Now, in the next section, let's make this a little bit more tangible and see how this scoring practice works for an example in the metals and mining industry. So from top to bottom, you see the 3 steps of the SDG framework, so the products and services, the operations, and the controversies. And from left to right, 3 examples of metals and mining companies. Now, here you see the KPIs against which these companies are assessed. And so what we see is that these 3 companies generate the vast majority of their revenue from providing industrial materials. And as a result, these companies get a +1 score on SDG 9 for providing the materials for the infrastructure, and SDG 11, the built environment. Now, why only a +1 score? That's because of our view that these type of services, they are enabling the impact, but they're not really a solution in itself. So that's why it's only capped at a +1 score. But now let's move to step 2. So here we see that example 2 is getting a +1 score on SDG 5, gender equality. So here we also have a top-down and rules-based approach in place, which assesses companies against 5 criteria that stand for good gender equality performance. And these include, for instance, addressing the pay gap, women's representation in higher management, and paid parental leave for both caregivers. Now, we see that the same applies for example 3, or company 3. However, this company also gets a negative score on SDG 12 due to high tailing dam risks. So here our sustainability analyst has assessed this company and deemed it to be having high tailing dam risk. And we also see that this has materialized into a controversy. So there was a severe accident related to this. So if we look at example 3, we see that it gets positive scores on SDG 9 and 11, but that it gets a negative score on SDG 12. And as a result, the final score for this company will be negative. And that means that it won't be part of any of the really SDG-aligned investment strategies. Now, we see that the same applies for example 1. You might be familiar with the company. But here, in addition to the negative impact that has been generated, our analyst has also perceived it that the company has not done enough to compensate for the damage that it has done in the first place, and that no preventative measures were taken from really preventing this from occurring again in the future. So only example 2, we see that it gets a positive score on SDG 9 and 11, it gets a positive score on SDG 5, and therefore it ends up with a positive score. And now I would like to take you along in a more recent assessment that has been added to the SDG framework. And this relates to water scarcity. And this is part of step 2 of our SDG framework, so the company's operations. Because water scarcity is increasingly posing a risk to the stability and resilience of our planet, as it can cause water-dependent ecosystems to collapse. Now, water scarcity and biodiversity collapse was also cited as one of the top 5 risks in the last edition of the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, as it also has potential negative impacts on human hygiene, human health, food security, and involuntary migrations. Now, water consumption is also one of those planetary boundaries, one of those biophysical processes that regulate the stability and resilience of our planet. And as was also highlighted yesterday during the summit days, by now 6 out of these 9 planetary boundaries are transgressed, and that includes water consumption. So all the more important for us as investors to account for these type of impacts in our investment processes and in our sustainable investment tools. Now, it is also important to note that water scarcity, as you see here in the Water Risk Atlas, it really varies by region. Some regions might be dealing with severe levels of water stress, especially arid and semi-arid regions, whereas in other regions this might be much less of an issue. So then, how might we score companies on their impacts on water scarcity and this issue? Now, first, in line with the philosophy of our framework, we have to focus on companies with significant impacts, be it positive or negative, right? So what we do is we focus on companies that operate in critical impact sectors. And here we use a classification by the Carbon Disclosure Project. Because you can wonder how relevant this issue is for a software company, for instance. So we only focus on industries where this is a critical issue. Secondly, we look at companies that have operations in those regions that experience water stress, because this is where that is the most significant impact. Now, ideally, here we would take a very science-based approach and assess companies' water consumption against the local regeneration rates at basin level and the local watersheds. But unfortunately, we don't have that granular data as an investor. We don't know how much consumption is occurring across the operations of a company. We unfortunately only know it at aggregate level. So we've opted for a forward-looking approach that assesses whether companies' trends in their water consumption are in line with a sustainable trajectory, or in other words, a trajectory that brings us back within safe operating spaces by 2030, so the deadline of the SDG agenda. Now, this recent report highlighted that we're currently exceeding this planetary boundary with 414 cubic kilometers of water every year globally. So that is 414 billion cubic meters of water. It's quite a daunting figure. But that means that at a global level, we have to decrease our water consumption with 1.42% year on year to get back in the safe operating spaces. So that is what we're assessing companies against. So if companies operate in line with that trajectory, they can get a +1 score on SDG 6 and SDG 15. But if they are stagnating or actually increasing their water consumption over time, they will get a negative score on these goals. Now, so far, the methodology of our SDG framework, and we use this framework to assess thousands of companies at the same time on their impact on sustainable development. So probably a good next step is to actually test whether these SDG scores really measure what we intend them to measure. So we did some research into this. And one of the first findings was that unfortunately there's not really an objective list out there that tells you which companies are the most or the least sustainable or have the most negative and the most positive impact. So we had to be a bit creative here. So what we did instead, we checked whether our SDG scores are in line with the sustainability preferences as communicated by investors, by regulators, and by scientists. And we thought whilst we're at it, we would do the same for ESG ratings. Now, for the sustainability preference of investors, we took some of the companies that are on the exclusion list of some of the world's largest asset owners and divided these in 3 categories. So tobacco and cannabis, human rights and weapons, and coal and other environmental damage. Now, for the sustainability preference of regulators, we looked at those companies that do not pass the do no significant harm principle. And for scientists, we looked at the top 100 most polluting companies in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, both in terms of scope 1 and 2 and scope 3. So what we see is that actually the vast majority of these companies are assigned a negative SDG score. On the contrary, what we see with ESG ratings is that actually a lot of these companies get either neutral or even positive ESG ratings. So what does it tell us? Well, it tells us that ESG ratings are not really well equipped to identify those companies that are doing harm in the world. Now let's look at the positive side. And by positive side, I mean those companies that are making a positive impact. So here for the sustainability preference of investors, we looked at some of the top holdings of the largest impact or thematic funds out there that are not managed by ourselves. In the clusters of health and well-being, water solutions, and sustainable energy. And for regulators, we looked at those companies that generate more than 2/3 of their revenues with taxonomy-aligned activities. So again, we see that the vast majority of these companies are assigned a positive SDG score through our framework. For ESG ratings, that's a different picture. And we see that actually a lot of these companies get neutral or even negative ESG ratings. So again, ESG ratings are not really well suited to spot those high impact opportunities, those companies that are doing something good for the world or providing solutions to those issues that are the heart of the SDG agenda. So what does all of this tell us? Well, first of all, we see that our SDG scores and ESG ratings are not really correlated. But this should also not come as a surprise because they're really intended for different purposes, right? So ESG ratings are there to identify risks and financial opportunities. So they look at how financially relevant ESG factors are. So what is the impact of sustainability on the bottom line of a company? SDG scores, on the other hand, take an inside-out perspective. So they look at what are companies doing for the world? How are companies impacting sustainable development? How sustainable are they? So the fact that these two are measuring different things, that doesn't mean that one is good or bad. And in fact, they are complementary. And together shed a more holistic light on the interlinkages between a company and sustainability. So also in our investment processes, they are used in tandem. So for instance, first you screen out which companies would you want to invest in from an SDG perspective. No negative SDG scores or only positive SDG scores. But after that, you can still, of course, use ESG ratings for identifying risk and opportunities. Now, that was the SDG framework and the SDG scores. Now let's move on to the second thing that we're sharing on as part of our open access journey. And these are our country ESG scores. So, as the term already suggests, this fits into the first pillar. So this is about identifying investment risk and opportunities. So our country ESG scores compare countries on a variety of E, S, and G features that we deem are material and financially relevant for investors. And this is a very data-driven approach. So we incorporate over 50 indicators for every country across the E, S, and the G domain to generate these scores. Now, for the environmental pillar, you could think about well, water scarcity and how water efficient a country is, but also how prone it is to potential natural catastrophes, because this can all impact how the ability of the country to redeem its government bonds. Now, for the social pillar, you could think about social stability and unrest, but also equality and demographics, for instance. And in the governance pillar, we look at things like political stability, but also levels of corruption. Now, and we weigh these different pillars with 30, 30, and 40% for environmental, social, and governance, respectively. And it goes into an overall score of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest score. And we have coverage of over 150 countries. And this is across the developed market, the emerging market, but also developing country space. And also here we conducted some tests. So first we tested whether our country ESG scores correlate with sovereign risk ratings. And actually the finding is that they don't really correlate. But we look at this quite positively, actually. We think this is a positive thing, because even though they're both risk metrics, they are both input metrics. And actually, we believe that with this, our country ESG are able to identify broader risks. So that has to do with the environmental, social, and governance pillar that would traditionally be overlooked at by these other initiatives. And secondly, we also checked whether there is a correlation between this and credit default swaps, as this is a good proxy for the risk premiums in the market. Now, obviously, these country ESG scores can very well be used in ESG integration in sovereign investment processes to avoid sustainability risk and seize opportunities. But they're also very useful in sovereign engagement strategies, especially the underlying information that goes into this. So you could start an engagement dialogue with a sovereign and use some of this data as an input, as a conversation starter, because they are financially material. Now, then let's move to the moment that we've all been waiting for, our SI Open Access Initiative. Because we're here to announce today that we're opening up these scores to the wider world. But in fact, our open access journey hasn't just started, and it actually commenced about a year ago, in August 2022, when for the first time we onboarded a couple of clients and academics on the platform and shared a subset of the SDG scores. Now, later on, we increased the number of SDG scores shared on the platform to over 12,000. So also today, we publish more than 12,000 SDG scores on our platform. We published the research that I just shed some light on, and in May last year, or May this year, we also added the country ESG scores. Now, so after having done this for a year and having onboarded over 300 clients on the platform and around 70 or even more academics, we've now decided to open this up to wider audiences. And you might wonder, why? Why did you decide to do this? Well, it's for a variety of reasons. So one is that we really would like to take an active part in driving standard setting in the market. Because one of the concerns, or one of the things that we see, that there's actually quite some disparity or disagreement around how, for instance, certain ESG raters are assessing how sustainable a company is. And we really believe that the investment industry, but the world at large, would benefit if we were to have a more uniform view on the sustainability performance of a country or a company. So by publishing our scores, we really hope to contribute to the standard setting and spark that debate. But at the same time, I'm also not standing here proclaiming that we hold the ultimate answer and that these SDG scores are the panacea to how sustainable companies are. So therefore, we're also actively soliciting feedback from key stakeholders, and in particular academics. So to use the wisdom of the crowd to further advance our approaches, to improve our methodologies, and we also invite you to share your feedback. Now, and lastly, we really aim to contribute to creating real-world impact here. So first of all, of course, acting in the spirit of SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, but also contribute to this concept of field building that I talked about earlier, and help investors globally, in particular those who are less acquainted to this field or are less familiar to sustainable investing, to really step up and also increase sustainable investing practices. Because only if the industry as large, if we create this critical mass within the financial industry to channel more capital towards those companies that are creating a positive impact and away from those who are doing harm, we can price in this impact in the market and influence the cost of capital of these companies. Now, as I said, to date we have onboarded around 300 clients on the platform, and from there we heard back that they're actually using these SDG scores, for instance, also in their broader investment processes. They use them in their reporting, and more generally defining a sustainable corporate philosophy. We've also onboarded academics to the platform, and what we've heard back from them is that they started to use these SDG scores in their teaching, in getting students acquainted at a much earlier stage already in how to look and assess the impacts of companies on sustainability. They're also being applied and reviewed in academic research, and the first publications referencing our SDG scores have recently been launched. One example on the right, but this one is from our own hand, is about who owns unsustainable or sustainable companies, as determined with our SDG framework, which looks at the institutional determinants of sustainable investing. Doesn't matter whether you're a PRI member or your home country, etc. It's an interesting read. And lastly, some more resources. So on the right, and I'll make sure that this slide is up as we close the presentation later, the methodology of our SDG framework and the country ESG framework, and a paper that we've actually launched this week that really aims to advance the debate on sustainable investing ratings. So first off, it delineates some of these principles, which we believe that a good sustainable investing rating that assesses a company's impact on sustainability should adhere to, and then introduces our SDG scores as a novel metric. All right. Unfortunately, I can't do a live demo of the platform, but our Sustainable Investing Open Access Initiative is as of now live on our website, and I do have a couple of screenshots of what it looks like. So here we see 4 companies in alphabetical order that are scored on with their SDG scores. So we see a restaurant that is assigned a -1 score, and that is because of negative scores on SDG 2, Zero Hunger, and SDG 3. So I don't know this company very well, but my assumption will be that this restaurant is supplying non-nutritious food or unhealthy food, basically. Then all the way on the right, we see Darling Ingredients. I do know this company a bit better, and it's actually a really exciting company. So what they do is they collect food waste from a variety of companies throughout the food value chain and sort of repurpose this into animal feed and other things. So therefore, this company is getting a very positive score on SDG 12, responsible production and consumption, and also SDG 2, as it also aims to supply nutrition for people and animals. And then we also have our country ESG scores. And I highlighted Switzerland here. So Switzerland is actually number 5 of the list. So it got an 8.5 on the environmental dimension, 8.2 on the social dimension, and 8.6 on the governance dimension, consolidates into an overall score of 8.75. So from an investor perspective, and again, this is a risk and opportunity metric, not an impact metric, we perceive this as a country that has low risk of defaulting on its government bonds. And with that, that was the presentation, and I would like to open the floor for any questions, any feedback. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation and also for the partnership. Yeah, you're achieving. I think Robeco is achieving one of the SDG goals by putting this out in the public. I was very curious to understand the 3-step framework and the data behind that, right? And as we know in the industry, right, data is a key challenge. It's been worked on. There are a number of data providers out there who are also coming out with their own let's say ESG ratings, but I understand this is SDG impact focused. But can you talk a little bit more about the data, how often this is updated, and because I think that will also give a better insight into how these SDG scores for issuers can be used as well.
Yeah, of course. No, thanks so much for that question. It's a really good question. So throughout the 3 steps of the framework, we apply different sorts of data. So in step 1 of the SDG framework, so companies' core businesses, we primarily look at revenues. What sort of activities do these companies generate their revenues from? And do we think that these services or products are good for sustainable development or bad? So good things you can probably think of water utilities, water treatment, and negative aspects. You can think of fossil fuels and gambling activities, etc. So mostly revenues in the first step. In the second step, we incorporate other sorts of data as well. So I refer to the gender equality assessment. So that is not focusing at revenues, but for instance, percentage of women in the board, or a yes or no, whether there's parental leave for both caregivers, etc. So it's a whole variety of data that we integrate, and it really varies across steps. Unfortunately, we cannot share the data that goes into the assessment because we're also bound by agreements with our data providers, basically. Even though that we are very willing to share our data, for them it's of course their core business. Data is their commodity, so we can't share the data that goes into it. Regarding your questions on how frequent it is updated, we have 2 sorts of scoring methodologies. So around 2,000 or around 1,500 companies are scored fundamentally. So it's actually our own sustainability analysts or other analysts throughout the firm that are covering these companies on their SDG impact. But we also have an automated scoring system in place because we can't do it for all 12,000 companies manually. And also here we incorporate vast amounts of data, and these are updated every quarter. Yeah.
Does this work? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. So I have a question regarding kind of the exhaustiveness of your framework, in the sense that when you're scoring a company, how do you ensure that you cover like the value chain? So looking into supply chains, tiers 1, 2, 3, are you being exhaustive? And if so, how would you ensure that it's comparable to different companies? Because we have so much lack of data, lack of historical data as well. It's also costly, but I guess you know Fairphone is a Dutch company, and they try to get a lot of data from their supply chain up until tier 4. So that would be an exemplary company, but it's just one out of thousands of companies.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question as well. It's really good. We do primarily look at companies' direct impacts and the direct impacts that they generate through their products and services. But in some instances, we also really take this supply chain approach or this value chain look-through. So for instance, the water assessment that I talked about, we're actually not only looking at companies' direct water consumption, but we're also looking at that the water extraction that is happening upstream in the supply chain. Because otherwise it would be fair for those companies that are very vertically integrated, unfair for those very vertically integrated compared to the ones that have sort of outsourced all the water-intensive business activities. Then that water consumption wouldn't be reflected in their data. So that's one example. Another example of a recent assessment that we've recently added is about palm oil, for instance. So you could choose to only focus on the palm oil plantations, but this is actually a very demand-driven supply chain. So also the distributors, the wholesalers, the food producers, and even the retailers, they really influence to what extent and how sustainably this palm oil is produced. So here we look at certification levels, for instance, for the RSPO, and also holding companies more downstream in the supply chain accountable for what is happening upstream in terms of deforestation risks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, my reaction to this is it's a laudable effort to corral a framework for sustainability and impact and measuring that. and so a couple of questions emerge. One, you make this open access, and to the degree that this is really a framework for coding, is there a way over time that this might actually gravitate towards something that looks more like open source, which is to say that the world contributes to the development of this? And then related to that is the ongoing parallel universes of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures morphing into the international standards of sustainability. And now we have a whole new array of nature-based kind of stuff, that this is a unwieldy cloud of everything. And but with AI and big data and lots of things, it seems to me that technology in computation and thinking might actually be able to manage this. But the question is then, therefore, so where is this headed? You put out and share open access, hey, this is what we're doing, but we can't share any of the data because it's proprietary, but your data is slim compared to every other reporting channel. So to what degree can an open source approach incorporating all of those other reporting things that many companies are happy to comply with, and global governance is moving in the direction, especially the European Union, of seeing to it that they do.
Yeah.
So what is the future of this in light of your data sources being sparse and your community, you're sharing a model of being able to actually build upon it collectively, which seems to be the aspiration of sharing it in the first place? I hope you can parse that into something you can answer.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll start with picking up at your second point, right? So indeed, there's a lot of different sort of metrics that are being developed, whether that's in the climate space, the nature space, and that's also what we see with us internally. So we have climate analytics and climate scores, we have biodiversity approaches and everything. And so the SDG framework, because the SDGs take a very holistic approach to sustainable development, that is really the integral framework, right? And where we can bring this all together. So that's step one of bringing this together internally. Yeah, and I share your I guess, concern or desire to have this, fully open access, have all the data available to every party that is willing to partake. As I said, unfortunately, we're bound by the contracts that we have with the data provider, so we can't share the input data. But the more also the input data becomes available through all these sorts of initiatives like the TCFD, the TNFD and everything, then it will be quite an ideal world if data becomes less of a commodity, also to enable all industry participants to start integrating more and more of this in investment processes. But unfortunately at this stage, this is what we can share. But do stay tuned for other metrics and other things to be added later down the line. This is only the first step of our open access journey. Yes.
Thanks very much. And yeah, well done with sharing the work. I guess one comment, you had a great graph earlier just showing the percentage alignment across the SDGs. Be curious to know how that sort of aligns with the recent sort of work that looks at the progress on the SDGs. Mm-hmm. There's got to be some relationship there, otherwise we're going backwards. Yeah. So, just a thought for your academic partners. And then perhaps maybe just a more direct question in terms of your actual investment, your activities as an asset manager. In your holdings, do you have companies that have misalignments with the SDGs?
Yeah, so maybe first to your first question. So indeed...
more of a comment, by the way, sorry.
Yeah, well, progress is not exactly where we want it to be, right? And so if we look at the SDG scores of these companies, for instance, in the MSCI World, All Country World Index, we do see that there are quite some positive scores. But then if you do look that level deeper, at which SDGs are positively impacted, we see that this is primarily SDG 8 and 9. And I don't know it in the fullest detail, but I think that is quite aligned with the recent research that came out on the current stance of the Sustainable Development Goals. So for instance, under SDG 9, there's a target for getting access to people to telecommunication services, etc. So this is this innovation and infrastructure that we're talking about, where companies really have an important role to play and are doing so. But very much agreed also in the sense of the negative impact, companies do play a big role here. So we could expect some alignment between how we score companies on these goals and how it works in practice. And your second question, please remind me.
Just about, about whether you, in your actual asset management activities, hold companies that have negative alignment scores.
Yeah, so we have a whole range of sustainable investing strategies. Some include ESG integration, and now more and more are also really these SDG-aligned strategies. So in that last part, we do exclude companies with negative SDG scores or only invest in those with positive SDG scores, but that's not the case for all our investments. Yeah. Another example, for instance, with these SDG scores, how they can also be used is in engagements, right? So if we look at those mechanisms through which investors can create an impact, exit and voice is one of them. So we also have a strategy where we actually use the SDGs as input for an engagement strategy. So deliberately, we're not investing in the leaders, but sort of in that mid-segment. So those companies that have an improvement, potential to really improve their impacts on the goals. And that is what the foundation of the engagement strategy. So we ask these companies for improvements on sustainability issues that are most critical to their business and are part of the SDGs. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions from me. First, there are some SDGs that are more transversal and less material in the sense that there's less materiality behind. And there are other SDGs that are more sector-specific and where products takes it's much more relevant. So I think the first case, SDG number 5 on gender, is probably more transversal and that's more difficult to measure. You said that you measure products and approach or behavior of companies. How do you mix the fact that for some SDGs is probably needed to give more weight to products, and for some other SDGs it probably makes sense to give much more weight to process or behavior?
Yeah. Shall I answer that one first?
Yeah, then
and then I'll give you the chance to give the second question. Now, thanks for that indeed. So, very much agree. So, and as I said in the introduction, the first step of the framework, so companies' core businesses, we really also believe that this is the core of a company's impacts, right? So really, if you want to create an impact as an investor, you identify those companies that are creating a positive impact through their products and services. So that's where most of the SDG scores are derived from. But indeed, some SDGs, so for instance, for SDG 10 and 5 and 17, we don't have any KPIs in that first step of the framework that are linked to those goals. And I would welcome your feedback on it. If you have any ideas of how a company, through its products and services, can have a really big impact on SDG 5, 10, or 17, be curious to hear that. But that's not the same case for their operational practices, right? So good gender equality performance, etc., that is relevant from an operational perspective. And we have those assessments in place. Yeah.
Thank you. And then start with the second question.
Yeah.
So it's easy. So how do you manage within an SDG the fact that a company might create some environmental harm, for instance, or whatever problems today, but then is committed and is seriously moving towards a better state? So I don't know, an example of a cement company that is emitting, by definition, a lot of cement, which is a lot of CO2, but then, of course, that's negative. So it might be seen negative for the SDG 13, but at the same time is a committed net zero company, and we know they're doing all they can to reduce the emissions. So you have this kind of a dichotomy that sometimes is, well, managing it and taking decision is a question of nuances.
Yeah. No, again, very much agree. And this also really boils down to that concept of significant impacts. Because cement companies are a great example, because cement is very useful. It's a very useful product, one of those enabling activities for infrastructure, built environment, etc. So it's necessary. But at the same time, it's a very polluting activities, and there's a lot of greenhouse gases associated with it. So in the SDG framework, we do have a KPI for this. So for cement companies, in principle, would get a positive score, also a +1 score. But if the carbon intensity in the production mix is above a certain threshold, then it is not able to get that positive score, for instance. But that has to do with the current impact. Your question also related to the future impact of companies. And so especially in the climate space, we're more and more also looking into forward-looking climate analytics, right? So carbon emissions and everything is what a company is doing at this very moment, or it's backwards looking. But ideally, we want to know where is a company headed in the future. So similar to what we saw with the water assessment, where we assess whether companies are in line with a certain trajectory, we're doing the same for companies for which climate change is a material topic. So we look at where the company is now. We draw a trend line where we believe that this company should go from now till 2025, 2030, and 2050, and assess their alignment with this. And for instance, elements that we're looking at is whether the company has set short-term targets, whether they have set long-term emission reduction targets, whether they have SBTI-approved targets, do they have the right climate governance in place, do they have CapEx alignment, et cetera, et cetera. All sorts of part of a broader credibility assessment of where a company is headed. All the way in the back.
Before you showed a slide comparing the SDG rating with different other providers, and I was wondering if you also did such an analysis with other SDG ratings, because if I'm correct, these were all risk ratings. so
Yeah.
ESG risk ratings. And I would be curious to know if other providers also have come to similar results, having like an SDG rating, and, or if also within the SDG rating bubble, there are different ratings coming out.
Yeah, no, exactly. So we're not the only SDG score in the market, and there's other players that are also introducing similar metrics. And unfortunately, we're also starting to see the same pattern as we see with ESG ratings, and that there's not that much of an agreement on how a company is scoring on that metric. There is a paper out that was not done by us that evaluates different SDG ratings in the market, so I encourage you to look it up. But this is really why we're standing here and why we're starting this initiative, to drive the standard setting in the market and really prevent the SDG ratings from going down the same path as ESG ratings. And by actively soliciting feedback and really getting also this academic traction, yeah, we're really hoping to contribute to the standard setting and getting one uniform view on the SDG impact of a company. Yeah.
Thanks. Can you elaborate a bit on the extent to which you've had companies responding to this, or are we only just going to see that now? Now it's sort of more broadly public.
Come again? Did you say how
companies?
Companies. Well, we're opening up this today. So this far, we've onboarded clients, so our asset owners and academics, but we haven't received much feedback from companies yet. But from academics, yeah, as I said, they've started to apply this in their research and methodologies and also in their teaching. But from companies, we haven't had feedback on how they're scoring. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, here we go.
Thanks. Actually, I have two questions. At InRate, I work for InRate, ESG InRate rating company. There we have an ESG impact rating. We don't call it SDG rating, but it looks very similar to your approach, and it would be very interesting to do a comparison there as well, where we also look at products and services and some KPIs. So just because you mentioned there is a paper out comparing SDG ratings, I think it's important that, while we don't call it SDG rating, it's very similar. It would be interesting to see a comparison. I'm not sure if you have done that kind of comparison as well. And then I was wondering, you mentioned that you have about 1,500 companies rated based on questionnaires, I think, or direct contact with the companies. And the other data is based on reported data from the companies and based on, I don't know, a model that you have. Can you elaborate on the data sourcing?
Yeah, so the 1,500 companies that I referred to are fundamentally assessed by analysts that work within our firm, so sustainability analysts, but also some financial analysts from investment teams. So they do fundamental research of the companies, how they're scoring against these KPIs. And then the rest of the companies are assessed through an automated framework. And here we make use of some natural language processing techniques, for instance, where you can think of that we're screening out business descriptions of companies, looking at certain keywords. So if a business description mentions something about coal, then we probably know that it's a negative impact or a negative impact company. Whereas if it says something about solar panels, then we would assign a more positive score. And we source in all sorts of data there as well, related to companies' revenues, how they do on gender equality, the level of certification within the palm oil industry, etc. So it's a whole wide variety of data that goes into that process. Yeah. All right. With that, I will close it. I would like to thank you all very much for coming and for your questions and your comments and everything. We would love to hear from you in the future. So if you go to our website and you browse through the SDG scores, etc., or the country ESG scores, also at the bottom of the page, there is a feedback form, basically, for which you can share your questions or your comments or your feedback or whatever, and to get in touch with us as well, because we would really love to hear from you. And with that, all that left me is also to thank the organization for having us and bringing such a wonderful event together. So thanks all again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.